It's the week of tragedies we would never forget. The historical tragedy of the Twin Towers falling on 9/11, and on the same day years later of Ted Cruz liking a stepmom, stepdaughter porn tweet on his Twitter. Neither we will forget. This is Super Politics, and I'm Decatur Brent.
And I'm Steve Daly, and with us today is...
Dr. Peter Pants.
We are back and in full effect, everybody.
Yes, we are now officially on double digits in full episodes. We're very proud to have made it this far, even though by now, the number of months we've been doing this podcast, we should be at like 30 or something, but yeah, we're not ashamed.
No, I'm not ashamed. We're not as ashamed of Ted Cruz liking porn
let's
tweets on 9/11.
Let's get back to that. Actually, before we get back to that, I do just want to tell everyone what the episode's about. Today, we're going to talk about the intersection of mental health and crime. Okay, now back to Ted Cruz.
I don't know. I mean, that's what he's into, right?
No, I'm just saying, like, the whole thing about liking a porn, what kind of porno thing? Like, what's the story behind that? I don't remember.
It was a stepmom, stepdaughter scene, I believe from Brazzers, that he liked. And I don't think that necessarily it's important to normally point out. But this week he was added to the short list of next Supreme Court nominees for the country. So yeah, I think he deserves to get ridiculed for that. Because I would if I was in that situation.
That's an interesting kink. And it's really interesting that he's coming out with that. Yeah, so that's really bad news that he's going to put on.
Canadians.
Oh my God, I forgot about that. Yeah, so speaking of which, like, Republicans are really weird about dual citizens. And he apparently was Canadian. By descent or whatever, he has some kind of right to be Canadian somehow. There was like this whole like scandal, which would only be a scandal on the right? Like no one actually cares. It's not like, oh, is he a secret spy for Canada? Like even if he is, who cares?
Steve, I gotta stop you there. You know how I feel about Canadians getting involved in politics in America. I got a big fucking issue with it.
Listen, we have Canadian listeners, so be careful what you say here, because I love my Canadians.
Listen, I love the Canadian listeners. I don't like the Jordan Petersons, that the Steven Crowders, apparently the Ted Cruzes.
Like the Proud Boys are now plaguing our country because of the Canadians.
The only problem with it really is the narrative that Canadians are always, ooh, throw A's. I don't know what Canadians sound like.
This is just a Canadian.
This isn't about me.
Now?
This is about Ted Cruz potentially being the next Supreme Court.
I think what Decatur's getting at here, and even if it's not, this is what I'm getting at.
Right.
Yeah. Is that when anyone spends a lot of time criticizing the politics of another country, it just gets under the skin of the people there. Like if this was a podcast where all we did as Americans was sit around and talk about what's wrong with Canada, that might annoy people. So that's, I think, what you're getting at here is there are Canadians who spend a lot of their time just sitting around criticizing the United States when like Canada also has its own problems with like, genocide and other things that they've done terrible to their indigenous people. So, let's be in this together.
Now, Ted Cruz is not the only terrifying person on the Supreme Court list.
But we have Tom Cotton,
who I believe is a senator from Arkansas. This man is a war vet from Afghanistan. Like he fought in the Afghanistan war, the Iraqi war. He's not Afghan himself. Pro the Portland federal troops out there going in and busting up the protests.
So he's in favor of secret police.
Yes, he is a super pro-Trumper. A lot of people have been floating his name for 2024, which honestly is a good sign because that shows that Trump isn't going to be there in 2024, possibly.
Yeah, right.
He won't be the president forever.
So this guy's obviously a war hawk and a terrible person. But actually what I want to say about this, and then we're going to get into the real content of this episode, is that we just did the last episode on fascism, and then these announcements come out. And what kind of struck me is that all the people on that list, at least that I looked up, are very, very pro-Trump loyalists. Their loyalty to Trump is the most obvious reason that they're on the list, above qualification, right? And I don't think that'll come as a surprise to anyone, but what I think is, my feeling is that as a democracy starts to fail and a fascist government starts to rise up, you see loyalty being placed above all else into who gets places in government. And that's what's really concerning to me, because the Supreme Court is an extremely powerful an important institution. We always hear about the Supreme Court like once or twice a year. You know, if you're not a lawyer, even for lawyers, to be completely honest, I don't follow everything they do. But you know, you hear about a few famous decisions they come up with once or twice a year. But realistically, they're working. They do about 65-ish cases per year. They actually weigh in on a lot of different topics, and they have power over a lot of areas of our lives in a way that very few people in this country have. So to have someone like Ted Cruz or Tom Cotton on the court is really troublesome.
Yeah, I have a quote here from Tom Cotton, if I can, just to put things into perspective before we get into this episode.
Go for it.
Because Tom Cotton really might be just devil sperm, whereas Ted Cruz just looks like an apple.
Okay.
So,
Devil sperm.
So this is a quote from Tom Cotton on June 1st, 2020. If local politicians will not do their basic, I should point out this is about the protests and the quote-unquote riots that the right is so terrified about. If local politicians will not do their most basic job to protect our citizens, let's see how these anarchists respond when the 101st Airborne is on the other side of the street. When asked about, hey, that sounds like you're talking about bombing protesters,
Wow.
he decided to say, and if necessary, the 10th Mountain, 82nd Airborne, 1st Cavalry, 3rd Infantry, whatever it takes to restore order. No quarter for insurrectionists, anarchists, rioters, and looters. Now, obviously, no quarter has normally meant don't arrest them and kill them.
Yeah, right.
So that is Tom Cotton, and it is the senator from Arkansas.
Just to be clear, you were right. So we have a really special show today, and what we're talking about, again, like I mentioned earlier, is the intersection of criminal law and mental illness and mental disability. And that is a huge topic, obviously, and as you know, my take already is that I think we lock everybody up instead of treating these problems as the actual problems they are in the way we're supposed to. And what's awesome about this episode today is our producer, Peter Pants, Dr. Peter Pants. He is actually a licensed clinical psychologist and currently works in forensic psychology. And that specifically means that he deals with psychology in the criminal law field.
Yeah, that sounds like pretty much the whole shebang right there, Steve.
So with that, we're going to take a quick break, and you're going to listen to this cool beat, and then we're going to talk about some stuff, and you're going to learn some stuff, and then you're going to tell your friends, and then you're going to give us all your money on your Patreon. All right. And that's when we started getting real philosophical. Oh yeah. You don't know the art we're trying to spit out right now. Art we're trying to spit out right now.
And we're here to say, fuck your liberal, huh? Fuck your liberal, huh?
You're upset that we went to Iraq for oil? Well, too bad. Take a look at your ass. You shouldn't be able to see it that easy.
How it works, lefties have something.
And we're on.
So, as Steve mentioned in the first half, we have an episode that we're doing on mental health because it's more relevant than ever, I would say, for a plethora of reasons.
Yeah, so there's been some recent news we want to bring up. And again, just the context of this is what we're going to get into here. Is I think a lot of people don't realize, you kind of hear it sensationalized on TV, like people talk about like the insanity defense, and everyone's trying to kind of get out of criminal responsibility because they're insane and it's all hocus pocus. But I think the problem is actually quite the opposite, is that we're over criminalizing behavior and treating behavior as criminal that is actually better treated as a mental health illness. And I think you'll be surprised by the statistics. Peter's just going to tell us about a few things that have kind of popped up in the news recently that I think kind of kicks this conversation off really well.
Yeah, I'll just go ahead and highlight a couple of things you may have seen in the news lately. There was an individual named Daniel Prude who apparently was in the midst of a psychotic episode in Rochester, New York, and was running through the streets completely naked. So people call the police on him, of course, because they're like, there's a naked guy running through the streets. The police show up. They tackle him to the ground. They put him in handcuffs. He's totally psychotic. So he's like struggling on the ground. The police put a spit mask over his head because he's trying to spit on people.
Which essentially is just a bag, right? Is it like it looked to me just like a kind of
it's basically like a hood.
Sack.
Yeah, I mean it's an unfortunate imagery because this is a black man who they put this white hood on, like a la KKK or some shit like this.
That's tragic. Yeah.
Right, and now there's and really this actually happened back in March 2020, but the reason it's cropped up in the news is because his family has obtained body cam images of what was actually going on that day. So ultimately, they're reviewing the body cam, and the police are engaged in this like really violent struggle with this guy on the ground, where they're driving his head into the ground. He's already got the mask on. He ends up vomiting in the mask, which probably contributes to some type of asphyxiation he experiences. But as they're trying to restrain this guy to the ground, he ends up passing out, and the police have to administer CPR to this guy to keep him alive. A week later, he ends up dying from these injuries. So it's this really unfortunate situation where the police come in and, you know, they're exercising all of this force. They're pinning his head to the ground, slamming it to the ground. There's an officer kneeling on his chest, contributing to this asphyxiation issue. And the coroner did rule that the use of restraint techniques is what caused the death of this.
That literally the police officers killed him.
Right, which caused the death of this man who's experiencing a psychotic episode, who essentially wasn't in control of his own faculties.
And his family, I believe, called the police in the first place because they were just worried about his mental.
Absolutely. He was visiting a family member and starting to exhibit these very bizarre behaviors, and that's when he came out into the street, and his family called the police for assistance to try to help get this guy the help he needed in the midst of the psychotic episode.
Like, I think what a lot of listeners are probably wondering is like, okay, let's see if there's even a plausible reason the police would have treated him that way.
The brother has talked to police and said, yeah, he showed up visiting me. Daniel Prude was from another state. He was visiting his brother in Rochester, New York. He showed up and was doing very strange things, like running through his house and like leaping down his stairs head first in a very dangerous manner. Wow. He ended up taking off his own clothes and ran out into the streets. Wow. And in the midst of this psychotic episode, when the police tried to detain him, well, maybe not, of course, but you know, as a piece of his mental issue at the time, he wasn't cooperating with the police, saying, you know, freeze, or, you know, don't move, put your hands in the air. He wasn't complying with those types of things because he was currently psychotic.
Right.
And the police, of course, view that as this person is being resistant, so we need to apply.
Well, before, I just want to interject just briefly, just for the listener. I think there's a great movement going on that's trying to denormalize a lot of kind of ableist slurs and different terms that we've gotten used to using as slurs, like calling people crazy and calling people stupid and these things. And I'm only saying them to just highlight what the words are, not to reinforce them. But just to be very clear, when we're talking about phrases in this episode, we're actually referring to the real medical and the professional use of the term, what they actually mean in a professional setting. That's not to say that words, even just because professionals use them, can't be damaging, but it is the most efficient way to communicate these ideas if they are actually the words used by the professional community. They have specific terms and meanings in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So, we just hope that no one's offended when we do use the terms that are actually accurate. For example, when Dr. Pants here used the word psychotic, he's not using that as a shorthand or the way we normally would use that word just talking to a friend. Like, psychotic has a specific meaning to psychologists.
Absolutely. And here I'm describing this guy had kind of a break from reality. He wasn't able to see or perceive his surroundings accurately or behave from his rational point of view. When people are in a psychotic episode, they often misinterpret what's happening in their environment. They often have severe emotion dysregulation that's going to lead to situations like resisting the police that they just don't have the rational thought to be able to comply with. So that's kind of why there's this tension between this mental health issue and the police, because the police see it as this person is resisting me, I need to assume control of the situation, and the other person doesn't have the mental capacity at that moment to reasonably comply.
Yeah, this is definitely a perfect example, too, of why mental health and law and order shouldn't necessarily cross paths the way they do as they do in America.
In theory, they're not supposed to, and we'll get into this more. Peter's going to give us some more examples here. But the kind of historical idea from several centuries ago, and I'm going to talk about this more, is that we really didn't think that and I'm going to use the term as it's used legally, the insane are criminally culpable. And that was based on several hundred years ago. This is back from England, and we thought that the insane were people who are incapable of being criminally culpable because their minds don't work right. Now, unfortunately, we had a very black and white view of there's only a small subset of people who are insane, and then everyone else is normal. And we've kind of still maintained that framework, even though our understanding of mental illness has expanded dramatically since we came up with this law hundreds of years ago in England. And so just to go back to Peter, I know you had another example of recent news.
Yes, this is something that happened even more recently, just this month in September, in, Salt Lake City, Utah. There's a 13-year-old boy with autism disorder. His mother's employment was disrupted by the coronavirus, so she was spending a lot of time at home with him. And on the first day she was able to go back to work, her autistic son, probably having a difficult time coping with that change, starts to have what the mom called a mental breakdown. The kid, people with autism spectrum disorders often have severe dysfunction in social interactions as well as emotional maturity. So this 13-year-old boy is having some type of mental breakdown. The mom calls the police to hopefully help get this kid the treatment he needs, or to a secure or safe facility where he can receive some kind of help or treatment for his episode. And the police come in. The kid runs away from the police because police are scary. And in the midst of a short pursuit, an officer pulls his weapon, fires at this 13-year-old boy with autism, and hits him multiple times with bullets. The kid ends up, his name's Lyndon Cameron. I wanted to make sure to say his name. He ends up with injuries to his shoulder, ankle, his intestines, and bladder. He ends up in the hospital with this. Fortunately, he didn't die. But the mother was so perplexed about, why did this happen? I called the police for help getting my son the help he needs, and they end up chasing him and then shooting him.
Which, by the way, where are the All Lives Matter people?
Right. Yeah, what about this kid's life? This is a bit of an aside, but All Lives Matter to me is not an actual thing. Like, that's just your rebuttal to Black Lives Matter to try to make that idea go away. So back to this story really briefly. So after the fact, everyone's like, what the hell happened? Why did people shoot at this kid? 13 years old, like, it's clearly a child, running away from the police. In a press briefing, one of the police sergeants claimed that they were responding to a call for a violent psych issue.
So they already knew, that, just to interject, like, that means as they're approaching, they already know they're going into...
Yeah, they know it's a psych issue.
Exactly.
Involving a juvenile, so they knew it was a kid, who had supposedly made threats to some folks with a weapon. And no one knows where that information came from, because the mom didn't report that the kid was making threats with a weapon. But that's what the police sergeant said. Oh, our officers thought the kid was making threats to people with a weapon. So they start chasing after him, and they shoot him. And of course, after an investigation, there was no indication the child had any weapon.
There's really no reason at all to give credit to the police for that claim.
And they shot him while he was running away.
Right. I mean, and this is the problem, too, how we view all mental health issues, I feel, in some degree, because it's never about protecting the mentally ill, right? It's about they're mentally ill right now. That's all I know, so I have to protect myself first, which is why the cops come out shooting.
I think that where we are right now is perfectly kind of summarized by Batman. And I know that sounds silly, but I mean this sincerely. And once you become a defense attorney, the whole world looks different to you. I can't watch Law and Order the same anymore. I despise the show. I can't watch any of those cop shows. It just glorifies state violence against the community. It's just complete garbage, in my opinion. And it's been a wild recruitment tool. I mean, I can go on a rant, but Batman is, of course, worse because he's not even a police officer, but it's a whole thing. But the problem, but where Batman comes into this, I can do a whole separate episode on Batman. But where Batman, look, I enjoy Batman, but the problem I have with Batman in the context of mental health is Arkham Asylum. And if you don't know Batman very well, Arkham Asylum is where all the evil geniuses, criminals go who are criminally insane. And I'm quoting, that's the phrase. It's Arkham Asylum for the criminally insane. The problem is that the phrase, I kind of alluded to this earlier, is the phrase criminally insane is an oxymoron. For hundreds of years, we've recognized that if you're insane, you are not a criminal. You can't be both at the same time. The concept of insanity means your brain is not capable of forming the state of mind you need to have to be considered criminal. We don't just We don't just outlaw people for their conduct. You have to be committing conduct with a state of mind that we consider bad. Specifically, you have to kind of be in control of your faculties, and you kind of have to want to do what you're doing. That's basically a not a totally professional take on how to describe
question
it.
2, real quick. You say you have a problem with the phrase criminally insane. Do you have the problem of Ice Cube saying lyrically insane?
What were you... If it's self-applied, no. If it's
As Steve is kind of alluding to here, insanity is actually not a clinical term at all. It's completely a legal term. So going back to the Ice Cube example of saying lyrically insane, then I would wonder, okay, well, what's the legal application of this? Is he implying that there is some type of breach of law in...
If you're lyrically insane, then you can violate copyright law and you're immune.
Well, you would
I think that's what he means.
you'd have to go back to Ice Cube's history with co-writing Fuck the Police with the other NWA members.
Right. Isn't that awesome? So,
All right, so circling back, I wonder, Steve, did you have any other explanations of how this applies to Batman? Because I wanted to take Asylum as a launching off point.
Yeah, that's a perfect launching off point for the history, so I do want to do a little rant on this. So, like I said, it's an oxymoron, but it goes much further than that, because what you see happening in Batman is the outright, like, the phrase itself is the oxymoron, but I'm less concerned about the phrase than the way they treat mental illness in Batman. They absolutely and 100% conflate in Batman the idea of being mentally ill or mentally disabled with being a criminal. That to them it's the same thing, and there's no reason to do any work of trying to distinguish it. Why would I even bother to consider whether Joker is actually just very troubled in a way that we could treat? Instead, we just need to put him in an asylum and call him a criminal, and he's thought of as evil. And I'm not saying that Batman's never broached the subject of mental illness. I'm just saying that the casual watcher, the takeaway from Batman, and which is actually to me a reflection of society right now, and why Batman was able to have this narrative and get away with it, is that we just think that people saying I shouldn't be treated as a criminal because I was insane is hocus pocus. We think it's made up. We think it's an excuse, and we don't actually, as a society, appreciate that the human mind is not just this like static thing, that your current experience that you're having right now as you listen to this podcast and you're comprehending everything we're saying and your understanding of reality, like that is not shared by everyone. And some people, in fact, their experience of reality is so very different than yours as a result of something going on in their brain that it really truly is absurd to treat them as a criminal, because the result, the solution, putting them into prison is not a logical solution, and treating them as culpable for their conduct is just immoral, because they don't actually have a lot of grasp on what's going on. And so anyhow, that's my little rant, but Batman makes no attempt, in my opinion, to distinguish those two totally separate issues of being a bad person and being mentally disabled or mentally ill.
Right, and the image you get from Batman is very much that these people are locked up in these desolate cells because they're crazy, and that's just what you need to do with crazy people. And I think there's an inherent contradiction there with the term asylum, because asylum is supposed to, like, the term asylum means a safe place in which persecuted people can seek refuge. The idea of asylums is that they're kind of these places that people can willingly go to when they are in need of help. Yeah, it's a beautiful concept, and that's just not how it ends up in reality. So let me kind of rewind things back here and talk about some of the origins of how we've gotten to where we are today with mental health. So prior to 1955 in America and Europe and other areas, mental health or serious mental illness, things like schizophrenia, very bad bipolar disorder, things like that, were situations that had very little treatment options. There weren't good medications to help people with psychotic illness. So that's why the primary way of handling people with that was to institutionalize them. Say, okay, they're never going to be able to function in society, so we're going to put them locked up in these institutions, asylums as they were called, and lock them away from the rest of humans. They can't interact appropriately.
Right, rather than being safe from society while they work out their problems. It's actually the opposite, where we're just safe for them.
So they were locked away in these asylums until 1955, when they developed the first effective antipsychotic medication, Thorazine, which gave relief of psychosis to many of these people who had never had any kind of treatment that actually effectively treated psychosis. So that's where the real push for deinstitutionalization came. In 1955, Thorazine came out, so you actually could stabilize some of these people and get them more functional in normal society. But then following that, the civil rights movement of the 1960s and so forth really contributed to this push for people to deinstitutionalize America and Europe and Canada and places like that, and help reintegrate these mentally ill people into society, which was a very noble cause, right? We want to be able to get these people out there so that they're not ostracized and pushed away out of our minds in society.
And of course, we don't have time to go into all the details, but some of the conditions in these asylums were horrendous, and they were lobotomizing people and doing all sorts of just unspeakable things to them because maybe they didn't have treatment options, maybe they did, but I'm thinking of like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest as a Hollywood version.
Right.
Or even like a newer version, like Sucker Punch.
There you go. So, I mean, this was a way to hide away these mentally ill people, keep them off the streets, right? So with the deinstitutionalization movement, they decided, okay, we can get these people out into the public because there's maybe some effective treatments that can get them functioning well enough to be out in public. It was kind of up to the individual communities to figure out, well, how do we support these people who still have some limitations, or maybe at times their medications aren't as effective, or they stop taking their medications for whatever reason. Now communities have this issue that they have to address with mental illness. So you had the rise of, initially it was kind of state psychiatric hospitals, where they were short-term hospitals in which the goal was to stabilize people until they were ready to be released. A few of the buzzwords they would use would be least restrictive setting. You wanted to treat people in the least restrictive setting, so if we don't have to lock them up and can step them down to, assisted treatment settings.
Give them as much freedom as possible.
Exactly. Whether that's kind of a day programs or group homes that support them for mental illness, whatever that is, it's best to be able to reintegrate them into society as best we can. Then later on, it was established that the criteria for civil commitment to a psychiatric hospital was that the person had to be an imminent threat of danger to themselves or others in order to be confined. So if they weren't an imminent threat of danger, the hospitals would move them on out, which in some ways is kind of a low bar. So sometimes people who still have quite a bit of psychiatric symptoms get moved out. And a lot of times, depending on the program available and the funding, a lot of these people who may still have some residual psychotic symptoms are being pushed out to homeless shelters.
Not to be the I hate Reagan guy all the time, but this was actually a big thing.
No, it's a fine thing to be all the time.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Well, this was a big thing during Ronald Reagan's governorship in California, where he passed, or under him, California passed the LPS Act, which infamously cut down a bunch of these mental hospitals, and everywhere in California was being called Skid Row at the time, and people were complaining that it's an invasion of mentally ill people, and it's because obviously that word is just horrible that people were saying it like that, but it's because people were saying like, hey, you're kicking them out of the hospitals and saying just go out to these homeless shelters. The homeless shelters couldn't have them, and now they're all on the street, just on the street.
Yeah. The push, the lowering of the bar to release people to the streets. My mind immediately went to this kind of starts to explain to me at least why we have such a huge mental illness problem on the streets right now with the homeless population.
Right, and I think that's how we got to where we are today. Our mental health resources are inadequate to treat the people and keep them stable and supported in the ways they need. Once they meet the very low bar of not imminently danger to themselves or others, we push them back out to whatever environment they can go into. If there's funding for group homes, maybe they'll at least be in a group home for a limited amount of time. If they end up being pushed to a homeless shelter, that's where they end up. And it becomes this revolving door of they're pushed back out into the streets. That's on them to pursue community treatment. And if they don't, they're going to likely have symptoms reemerge and end up back in the hospital or in conflict with law enforcement.
And group homes, very stigmatized, obviously. A lot of people don't want to have to go through any sort of that process for them or their loved ones.
Right. And just like the irony to me of just kicking people out to the curb and then expecting them to take their own initiative when they're suffering from these potential psychotic issues or whatever, to like make the right choice. Like, hey, this is on you. This sounds very Reagan-esque to me. Of like,
yeah, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, even though there's something going on that we should try to be helping you with.
Yeah.
But no, you can figure it out on your own and get back to it.
Do what you can for your country, not for yourself, right? I'm not
Right.
very...
Or Ayn Rand. Like,
oh, very much.
If you're the weak loser type person, to use Donald Trump's terms, if you are a loser who has mental illness, then you deserve what you have coming for you.
Right. Well, apparently to Donald Trump, you don't even have to have mental illness, like being a war veteran or prisoner of war. He's basically anything that you could do for your country or yourself. You're a loser. So.
Right. So, Steve, basically what you were describing in psychological terms is called the just world hypothesis. It's saying that we have this cognitive flaw in our mind that wants to justify why things happen in the world. We have this kind of crazy notion of karma in which, what goes around comes around. If you're a good person, you're going to get what you deserve, and that's what's coming to you. And if you're poor or if you're marginalized in any kind of way, it's because of something you deserve.
Right.
And it's something that people who are in positions of power really kind of dwell on as something that justifies their behavior in relation to others. This justifies my extreme wealth. This justifies the fact that I can exploit other people.
Yeah. And I think that what's so interesting about this, it obviously touches on a lot of things about our culture. In no small part does it explain, the criminal justice system as well as just capitalism in general. If you think about mental health and how does that fit into the picture, mental illness and mental disability, how does that fit into a capitalist worldview? If you hold the just world hypothesis, if you believe in a meritocracy, to me, what was so interesting to me about doing this episode, besides the fact that I interact with the intersection of criminal law and mental illness every day in my job, is also the fact that I think that mental illness and just disability in general is the ultimate rebuttal to meritocracy and capitalism. It just proves that you can't build an economy on the concept that we're only going to give you money for doing work in a specific way. And if you have any challenge, if you have any disability trying to be productive, then we're just going to leave you high and dry. Yeah. Right. And that's like, that proves, and then so like, what do we do and this is like kind of neoliberal politics. We talk about like centrism and stuff. And the solution to a lot of people is, instead of rethinking our entire economy and what we value as a society, instead we just put Band-Aids on everything. Right. The problem is that there, and what I mean by Band-Aids is we'll have like welfare and we'll have other programs that, let's have a few state psychiatric hospitals or asylums or whatever. But then at least asylums were a more robust program. What we did instead, the problem is we have this principle that like the Reagan era really made our kind of national ethos of like this meritocracy, this just world philosophy, that we now have this inherent conflict between taking care of people who cannot take care of themselves, or they have extra challenges to take care of themselves, or they can't justify their worth to society in the traditional capitalist way of working a 9-to-5 in the way that you'd like them to, behind a desk sitting at a computer. It's just not something they can do the same way that other people can. So, and it's not what they're best at. And that's an inherent conflict with someone who's trying to justify our entire economy on the profit motive. If our entire economy is designed to make as much profit as possible so we can brag about our GDP, then the mental illness is an indictment to that, because we don't have an answer to that. That's why I think, as I was listening to Dr. Pants over here, I laugh every time, Dr. Pants over here talking about, how we started to ramp down our resources for the mentally ill and the mentally disabled, to me, I'm just thinking, of course we were. This was all happening, especially around the Reagan era, and we started like just getting rid of these because, well, you know, it doesn't jive with the worldview that you should take care of yourself.
So let me drop a few more stats here. Americans with mental illnesses make up nearly a quarter of those killed by police officers. So a quarter would be like 25%, whereas maybe 4 to 6% of people in the United States have a mental illness. 40% of adults with serious mental illness will come in contact with the criminal justice system during their lives. As someone who works in both systems, that number actually seems low to me. I work in a mental health system in which there's a forensic element to it and a civil commitment element to it. We take in patients who have been arrested for some kind of a crime. Whereas the civil commitment hospital is people who fall under the dangerousness to themselves or others aspect of hospitalization. In the civil hospital, they don't have any pending criminal charging. But the people who end up in our civil hospital are by and large the exact same people who end up in our forensic hospital. All of the time, people who end up in our forensic hospital have a pretty pronounced history in our civil hospital and vice versa. So we collaborate heavily with the treatment providers in the other hospital because we'll look up the person and say, oh, they were at our civil hospital 3 months ago. Let's talk to those doctors and see what was going on back then, because that will help us inform our treatment of them here in our forensic hospital. A couple more stats here. Jails and prisons currently hold more people with serious mental illness, 365,000 individuals, than hospitals do.
Jeez. Which is consistent with what we said about Nevada.
They remain in jail 4 to 8 times longer than people without mental illnesses charged with the exact same crime.
4 to 8 times longer, just because they had mental illness. I mean, I'm not saying that because, but that's the variable we're isolating. I did not know that. That is really upsetting.
Imagine getting a sub and you get one 4 to 8 times longer. If you got a foot-long sub and then that's what you order, and you get a 4 to an 8-foot-long sub,
Right.
That should put it in perspective how ridiculous that sounds.
That's actually a great way to visualize it, and now I'm hungry.
Yeah, but no one wants Subway. Go on.
All right, a couple more things. They're less likely to make bail, which is not surprising at all because A, they probably don't have the financial resources, and B, they need to have the mental faculty to kind of initiate that process.
Right, they might not even conceptualize. It just depends how serious mental illness is we're talking.
Right. And they're more likely to gain new charges while incarcerated. Things like battery by prisoner, which is a felony.
Well, it's a terrible environment for that. You're mixing people who actually are, committing crimes intentionally with the mentally ill. It just seems like a powder keg. Let's take a quick break, and we're going to talk about some cool stuff that is happening, and then we're going to talk about why we don't have that right now.
Dr. Pants, I wanted to know, what is psychologically wrong with Steve Daly?
I do have an issue. I am, without question, as my good friend Pete has reminded me several times, actually, I have ADHD, without question. And actually, I kind of wanted to mention that, and I forgot that I wanted to, only because, like, anyone listening to this, in case you're not sure where I stand on this issue of mental illness and disability, there's a really great episode recently of a podcast. There's a magazine called Current Affairs, and they have a podcast as well. And the episode that they did, it was on the social model of disability, and I encourage everyone to go check it out. But essentially, the social model of disability is trying to reframe the entire conversation about disability to say, it's not something necessarily wrong with yourself as much as it's also, if not more, a problem with the way society fails to accommodate you, right? So the social model of disability is, well, for just a really crude example, if you can't get up a flight of stairs because you can't, you're in a wheelchair, well, you're only disabled in the context of a society that hasn't provided you a ramp. With a ramp, you're not disabled. You actually can get to where you're trying to go. So it's a different way of thinking about these issues. And so what I just want to say is, in the mental health arena, the term that people use for the social model of disability is neurodivergent. It's that you're not mentally disabled. It's just a different kind of phraseology, so to speak, of this whole concept of I have just a different brain. It's not qualitatively better or worse. It's just a brain that isn't like other people's. It works in a different way. It might not be as efficient at, processing speed. I might not be able to sit behind a computer from a 9 to 5 and work in the same way other people do. But I do have periods of hyper focus where I can focus on something for hours on end if it's something I'm particularly interested in, and to a degree that other people wouldn't. And there's other trade-offs and benefits, and my brain is just different than other people's.
I think the ramp example is perfect. I think that that really does sum up there are changes that the structure and the institution can make that make it no longer an issue in a lot of ways. And you should not be held back because you're ADHD. You should be held back because you're just a bad person.
Yeah, right. But that's a separate issue.
Yeah. You're lyrically insane.
Right.
But your ADHD has nothing to do with it.
Right. And the reason I wanted to bring that up is, obviously mental illness, quote unquote, mental disability, extremely common, right? And it's to varying degrees. And I just want everyone listening to appreciate that not only do I personally identify with the neurodivergent concept of disability, but I also believe in it for you. And let me just hit the rubber to the road now. So we've talked about how many more people are arrested and how much more time you serve and all of that. I want to talk just from my own kind of legal knowledge a little bit about how this plays out in a courtroom and kind of why we're not handling this right. Once you're arrested and once you're charged with crimes, I'm skipping over a lot of important decision points where we shouldn't even be getting to that point. But if you're arrested and you're sitting in jail and now you're about to have your trial and you had a serious mental illness at the time of your offense, there's really two answers that your lawyers can look at. I'm going to talk about one, Peter will talk about the next. The first one I want to talk about is the insanity plea. We brought that up earlier. And just to give you a really crude understanding of it, the insanity plea started out as this really egalitarian idea, like I mentioned earlier, that we don't want to consider someone who can't kind of control themselves or there is in the throes of a delusion is kind of the way it's been framed. And we don't want to consider them criminals. We want to recognize that they're not exactly culpable for what they do. That said, the way it's been, we've moved kind of through the Reagan era to where we are now is now we just think of that as an excuse. And so how that plays out in court is practically no one ever succeeds in convincing a jury they're insane. So when you roll your eyes and you hear on TV oh, so-and-so is going for the insanity plea, give me a freaking break.
You just said that like Sarah Palin, by the way.
Give me a break here. So, but you have nothing to worry about because the insanity plea hardly ever works. Now, every state has a slightly different test. A lot of states share the same test. I actually think that if we look to the historical test and we look back in time as to what the test was supposed to be, it actually should apply to a lot more people than judges currently apply it to. And that actually, if we were more true to the kind of, this is a conservative way of looking at the law, but if we look at first principles and this kind of original idea for the insanity plea, it actually is a broader test than we currently, it should protect more people. Insanity defense, it treats the world like black and white. You're either insane or you're not. And the reality is, of course, mental illness and mental disability is on a broad spectrum, and treating everyone like they're equally culpable if they don't meet the insanity test is a disgusting dereliction of our duty to responsibly handle mental illness. So we're just going to close this episode out talking about just doing a little roundtable on policy. And I know I already started to answer it before, but to me, the school shooter situation, I would like to envision a world eventually down the road that we've improved our social services so much that we don't have school shooters. Now that, of course, sounds naive to a lot of listeners, and that's fair. And so what do we do when it inevitably happens regardless, despite our best efforts to prevent it? And I think that is when you do have, hopefully we've redesigned our criminal justice system, quote unquote. A lot of people don't call it that anymore. It's maybe the criminal legal process or whatever, because there's not a lot of justice involved. That said, we've redesigned that system to a point that now we aren't looking at people as good and evil, but instead we're just trying to take a holistic look at what happened, what was going on in their mind at the time, and what is the kind of utilitarian approach to the problem. So how do we prevent future harm the most? Like, what would be the best response to what happened that we can prevent future harm, and also make sure that the victims are adequately accommodated and adequately the wrongdoer is accountable to the victims. And sometimes there's a lot of victims and that might not even be practical, but also there's no accountability by just throwing them in prison, right? Like that, all that does is punish the wrongdoer, but what does the victim get out of it besides some kind of sense of retaliation, which I'm not to say does nothing. It does a lot emotionally to some people, not everyone.
We always talk about the victim after they've been victimized, but really the best solution here is to figure out how to stop them from ever being victims in the first place, right? Exactly. And there's a lot of things we could do in this country to promote less, criminality with a lot of simple things that could really help with mental health. I think we're talking about solutions here. I mean, we don't even have fucking healthcare for people. But what are some other solutions you have?
It's almost ridiculous to talk about solutions until we have single-payer healthcare, because that's so obviously the first thing you need. But of course, let's move past that. One of the things that a society could do better, of course, you hear a lot about this CAHOOTS program, is that when you have a violent incident that has happened, I know I'm actually kind of going out of order. You wanted to know about how do we prevent it. But when a violent incident does happen, or a criminal incident happens that we consider criminal now, there's at least Eugene, Oregon, and other jurisdictions looking at doing the same thing, where we would, instead of have a police response, I'm not talking about a school shooting now, because obviously there's an argument that you need to first make the scene safe before you do this. But when you're having a clearly psychotic outburst happening, then in that situation, a program like the CAHOOTS program in Eugene, Oregon, what they do is when someone calls 911, and this is actually a better example for what Peter was talking about earlier with the 2 psychotic episodes where the police ended up killing the person experiencing a psychotic break. When someone calls 911 for those kind of incidents, instead of police officers responding, then in fact we have trained mental health professionals who know exactly how to respond to those kind of things, and they don't treat it as a criminal matter. They treat it as what it is, a mental health issue, and they would have another way of responding. That's not to say that you might have a backup police officer who's there in case everything goes awry or whatever, which I think we could do without still, most likely, once we get to that point. But that's a really, really, really important. Another really important thing is there's this organization called Common Justice in Brooklyn, and they're doing something really remarkable. The director is interviewed on several podcasts, so just type in Common Justice and you can go hear her talk, read about her organization. She's a survivor of violent crime. And what she recognized, and she started a nonprofit because in her experience, the criminal justice system does not actually help the victims very much. They give them this kind of abstract sense of like karmic justice, right? But they don't actually really do much to improve the situation of the victims. And there's a lot of argument to be made that she does make, is that victims are actually much happier with a more rehabilitative and restorative justice solution than lock them in prison as long as you can, right? Now, when your only option you're giving a victim is we can completely ignore the crime, or we can lock them in prison forever, well, of course the victims are going to be like, well, fucking get me justice, right? But what we found in Brooklyn, and she's been doing this for a while now, is that when victims are given the choice, do you want us to pursue this as a criminal matter and put them in prison, or do you want to work with this nonprofit and work out a contract with the wrongdoer, who then he can work his way back to being accountable to you? You can work out something together with us as mediators where we can work together on what do you want that victim to, that wrongdoer to do to kind of be accountable to you, where you will feel whole, or at least as whole as is reasonably expectable, and that person also doesn't have to have their life thrown away by going to prison. What do you think, like, I'm not going to put you on the spot to actually ask, but I'll just say hypothetically, like, what would you guess the percentage of people who pick prison over the rehabilitative program? Well, and I'll just answer, it's 90% of people pick the rehabilitative program and reject These are the victims deciding that they want, in 90% of cases, they'd rather not send the person to prison when they have a better option, when they have a more holistic and egalitarian and compassionate option. And mind you, this is the victim choosing. This is like when we have all this rhetoric about we're pro-victim. That's why I put people behind bars. Like a prosecutor will beat their chest like, oh, I'm a victim's advocate. Well, if you actually gave them a choice and provided them something more rehabilitative and restorative, they would not want what you're giving them. So the answer, even to the school shooting, I would still want the victim to be involved in the decision, the victims in that case, the families to be involved in what would be the best response here. But, of course, we're hoping for a society where we don't even have to get to that point. So there's my very long-winded answer, but I know Peter has some stuff to say on this, so let's hear what he's thinking.
Yeah. Holy cow, you just answered every question, every answer to every question we've ever had.
Yeah, just implement my views and society will be better and we're fine. What do you think we should do about this?
So, I mean, what you've spoken to so far is like maybe an alternative to police intervening right. in mental health crises right. when police are just not equipped to do that. I recognize that is a tough position we put police in to say, here's a crazy person, you don't have enough training to really deal with this, you know how to handle criminals, so go try to apply the one thing to the other. Like that's a tough situation. That's why a lot of issues end up occurring. So what you're speaking to here is kind of alternatives where people who are actually more qualified to de-escalate and right. intervene and redirect them to potential rehabilitative services. Those are the types of people who should intervene in mental health type issues. But I think the other piece of this is backing up and asking ourselves, how can we structure society differently or put better supports in place so that people with mental illness aren't ending up in these types of situations where they can be perceived as dangerous or criminal and that they're having these interactions with law enforcement. Obviously, my short answer is socialism.
Thank you. And now our podcast is over.
Let's talk about democratic socialism.
But at least more socialized programs. Yeah. Because what's happening right now is there's inadequate...
You mean in terms of just like what could we realistically achieve through democracy, step by step, we'd have to start with socialized programs.
Right, because what's happening right now is there's inadequate funding for these types of things. There's inadequate structures for these types of things, the types of supports that mentally ill people would need in order to stay stabilized and stay out of situations where their illness will manifest in dangerous ways. So I think a big piece of the issue is kind of the privatization of a lot of the services that serve these people, private hospitals, private group homes, private psychiatric practices in which it becomes a money-making venture to provide any kind of services to these people. I think in many ways that makes it, when you're looking at profit and the bottom line, it causes you to not give the best services you possibly can.
Right. For whoever is involved, right? If it doesn't make profit, then what's the point?
Right. If you can cut corners in the interest of profit, that's a benefit too.
In the words of T.I., if it ain't about money, don't be blowing up my phone.
Absolutely. So I think ultimately it would be useful if the government could provide more of those types of services, because in that way they would have more of an eye towards providing effective services to these people, because as far as the government's concerned, that would be profitable, because down the line you're having fewer instances where mentally ill people are being involved with the law and they're getting arrested and they're ending up in prisons or in forensic hospitals or places that are clogging the system and sucking resources that we could put into prevention of these issues. Yeah.
I can't think of ways that would make it easier for Donald Trump to get reelected than listening to this conversation. It's ridiculous. We're not going to throw out capitalism. We tried that. Other countries tried that. It was called communism, and it just didn't work.
And listen, and just so you know how comfortable you can speak on this podcast, I don't think you need on this podcast to justify everything and how it balances the budget, because we spend an unprecedented amount on police and on our military, and it's really hard to justify how they render profit for our country unless you're saying that they are supporting
This is all for a different fucking podcast. Let me just say right now, for all these fucking John Kasich hacks, like, there's no such thing as balancing the budget. This shit means nothing. Like, this idea, there's so much information on just like, we can fucking print money and it doesn't fucking matter. It's bullshit. Anyhow, sorry, go on.
No. But that is actually exactly two things on top of each other. One, we have plenty of programs that don't justify themselves monetarily. I mean, how do you justify a park, but we still want them, right? They're still nice for society, but arguably way less important than this issue. And you talk about the military, and of course, if you know the dark side of the military, of course, it makes a lot of money for some people, just not for society at large. It makes a lot of corporate lobbyists and corporations really rich. But my point is like, obviously government is not afraid to spend money on things that they can't justify showing a full return. It's nice to be able to justify it though. And that's actually what makes it particularly egregious, is that what Dr. Pants is talking about here is that we actually could justify economically why it would make sense to offer these programs, and why it actually would almost, I don't know if it would be budget neutral, but arguably it would be. And I think that that's like particularly egregious, that even when we could justify it through this kind of like austerity type of like trying to avoid any kind of deficit spending, that we're only trying to make sure everything justifies itself monetarily, we actually could justify this without having to just say, yeah, we're going to have, but my point is, I'm okay with reaching into my pocket for something that doesn't return every dollar back to me. It's just because this is worth it. But it happens to be that we can pay for this on its own face, because it's ridiculously expensive to neglect the mentally ill, because we eventually have to pay for them. But by the damage caused by neglecting them is worse.
And I don't know if you guys are familiar with community schools, or some call it social education systems, where it's this idea that we kind of have an old analog phone for a school system now, where it should be more like a smartphone, and we should be implementing mental health services directly within the school, like funding this incredibly high, and like getting kids in like therapy and
really normalize it.
Yeah, normalize it completely, and just teaching kids social interaction and emotional intelligence a lot more throughout education, which we do not do at all in our school system now, which I do think would make a huge difference. And that was actually also something that Bernie Sanders was trying with one of his platform policies, was community education. So,
yeah, speaking of privatization, then we have Betsy DeVos, who's trying to privatize education as much as she possibly can, so that we continue to leave the most vulnerable, marginalized students in our society in really shitty schools, whereas if you want to have decent education, well, just fucking pay.
No, I love that you brought up privatization. I mean, that's exactly that's fundamental, right?
Prisons,
yeah. Oh,
same fucking issue.
It's the same problem. And so this is kind of the thing, and this is kind of just emblematic of how capitalism works in general, is that we neglect issues that don't justify themselves on a profit basis, and then we have our police just go in to clean up the mess after, and it actually costs a lot more than if we would just pay for it in the first place. But that's actually kind of hard to sell for a conservative on the fucking stump speech to be out there talking about how, like, well, trust me, it makes more sense to be charitable and to have social programs, right? Like, it actually could make sense to treat our citizens equally and nice in a way that the problem is that it's contrary to their overall laissez-faire economic model. This whole, like we were talking about earlier, the just desserts, their entire theory of society is that where you're at in life is where you deserve to be. And if that's the fundamental message they're trying to get Americans to believe, then they can't in the same breath say, oh, by the way, we should provide social services and free education and all this other stuff.
I know this podcast really took a hard left turn here when I threw out the word socialism, kind of the issues with privatization and things like that. As a society, we have to ask ourselves, like, what is our value in helping the most vulnerable people in our society? And if we have the capabilities of doing that, why not?
Thank you for being on. Everyone, thank you for listening. I hope you are now socialist from listening to this one episode, but even if not, please at least vote for social programs that help the mentally ill.
A matter of fact, Steve, we forgot to say our sponsor for the episode.
Who is our sponsor?
Our Patreon. All right, guys, we're getting out of here. Once again, thank you to Dr. Peter Pants for a wonderful conversation where I do feel like I am much more educated on the topic for sure.